In 2019, all forms of gambling were made illegal in Albania, except for a handful of land-based casinos. But recently, the government announced plans to legalize online betting and for all revenue generated by it to be funneled into state programs for sports. The law is in its last stages and is currently being debated in various parliamentary committees. But during the recent discussions, a number of concerns have been raised, mainly over supervision, problem gambling, and the risk of money laundering. I reached out to international iGaming legal expert Ron Mendelsohn to ask for his views on the proposed Albanian law and overcoming industry-wide challenges. Good afternoon, Ron. Thanks for joining me today. One of the main issues raised by opponents to Albania's law is that the previous ban did not stamp out illegal online or offline gambling. Therefore, there are concerns over how the new rules will be enforced. Now, in your experience, what kind of resources are needed to guarantee adequate supervision of a licensing regime?
Having no laws or having laws that are too strict will not stamp out online gambling. Having no laws drives players to a black market, which puts them at risk, especially if they are problem gamblers. Having too stiff of a regulatory regime or over enforcement, as I call it, or over regulation, is the same evil. You make it impossible to comply, which drives gamblers to black markets and again leaves vulnerable and problem gamblers open to abuse. So the key thing to any kind of enforcement regime or legal regime for gambling is realistic regulations that are enforceable and the resources necessary to enforce them.
Now, when we look at the Isle of Man, which is a highly respected gambling jurisdiction with very strict standards and regulations, we can assume that this is probably not just 2 or 3 people sat in an office overseeing everything. I'd assume it takes a lot of resources, financing to implement these regimes.
100%. The most critical thing for a regulatory regime to work is, number one, competent people in the positions that supervise the participants and stakeholders in the regime, sufficient resources to employ those people and to give them the tools they need to oversee the regime. And really, it all begins with your applicants, properly screening applicants, ensuring you have applicants that are properly funded, that have experience and have competent people on their teams is where it all begins. That makes ongoing enforcement much easier because you have people who are experienced and able to guide a business through the compliance process and through the regulatory regime in a satisfactory way.
Now, having had a cursory look at the proposed law, what are your thoughts of it? I mean, using your experience of jurisdictions abroad, are there any glaring omissions or issues that you see?
Well, a regulatory regime is always good. It's always good to ensure that there's balance in place to protect the businesses and the stakeholders. Everyone, any kind of regulatory regime is supposed to be a win-win situation where everyone benefits. Society, the community, the participants, the players, the owners. The biggest problem I see is, from what I understand, Albania has had a problem in the past with enforcement of regulations. So creating new regulations isn't going to fix anything if they're not enforced. So the first step, I think, would be to find a way to effectively enforce whatever regulations are going to be implemented. It's the only way things will work.
Now, many concerns have been raised about problems of responsible gaming and addiction. In Albania, there's not so many resources for people with problems with gambling. How can the government ensure a balance between the revenue generated by iGaming and being responsible in terms of addiction?
Well, responsible gambling is a bigger issue than most people realize. Gambling addiction is part of a larger problem. It's a mental illness, and it needs to be treated as such. So it's not about the gambling, it's about the addictive behavior. And people in that position are vulnerable. So having a robust set of responsible gaming policies and regulations is critically important. But on top of that, like you mentioned, you need to have the resources in place to help those people. So mental health services, organizations like GAM Care that cater specifically to people with gambling addictions should be involved or be part of this process, and their services should be made available.
Now, a very sensitive subject, the problem of money laundering. Albania is on the FATF grey list. It has established problems with money laundering. But in terms of the overall iGaming sector, how big is the issue of money laundering? Also, the second part of the question, the Albanian government has said that it will only allow payments to be done digitally via registered and licensed providers. This, they say, will fix the issue. How realistic is this?
Well, I don't think anyone really understands fully how money laundering works through the iGaming space. I mean, definitely it's an issue that needs to be monitored on an ongoing basis. You know, money laundering and terrorist financing are definite dangers to our society, and we have to be diligent to ensure that the iGaming space isn't being abused by those bad actors. Going digital payments definitely helps limit and mitigate those risks, because it's not cash in a suitcase. You know, digital monies enter the digital system and are scrutinized when they come in, and are typically scrutinized as they move along. So there's multiple points of scrutiny and revision, which definitely dramatically reduces the chances of money laundering.
But should a country struggling with money laundering and enforcement be looking at focusing on potentially risky industries?
Well, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, iGaming can bring a lot of opportunities for young economies and emerging economies. It can create booms in employment and in industry in general, from administrative jobs to office space rentals. So there's a lot of opportunity in the iGaming field. Money laundering, on the other hand, is also an issue. And yes, as they say, you know, the man who chases two rabbits doesn't catch any. So I mean, that's true. I can understand the concern, but I don't see why competent officials couldn't attend to both issues at the same time. The key being the competency. And this takes resources. So if the government is committed to investing resources in both of those channels, then of course they stand a great a great chance of success. But it requires those resources.
I also contacted the European Commission to ask for their view on the draft law. They explained there is no sector-specific EU legislation, but that gambling providers should be subject to the Anti-Money Laundering Directive. They reiterated that any law should ensure a high level of protection for consumers and vulnerable persons, while having adequate administrative and law enforcement capabilities. The Commission did add, however, they have not been consulted on the draft and have not seen the law, but that during the EU accession process, Albania's legal framework will be scrutinised for compliance with the EU acquis. Last but not least, my poll of the week is back. I took to Twitter to see what my followers think of the draft law. Out of all of those who responded, 18.3% think the legalisation of online betting is a good thing. 67% are not so convinced it's a good thing, and around 15% are not sure. We will be back after the break.